Hi folks, Dr. Rob Barrington here with some more nutrition advice. Now this video is going to be about creatine, and I wanted to make a video about some of the lesser known metabolic effects of creatine, or at least some of those effects that are not talked about in mainstream circles so much. And I also wanted to make some tentative suggestions about why certain people don't get on so well with creatine monohydrate supplementation, and perhaps why some people actually get detrimental effects that can include weight gain. And I want to just talk around this subject. So I've made some notes that I'm going to refer to about this because I wanted to refer to one or two studies that have been done. So if I have a look at my notes, please apologise for that. Firstly, I wanted to talk about the effects that creatine can have on the insulin and glucose system. And there's a number of studies that have been done on creatine monohydrate and how it affects insulin or glucose homeostasis. Many of these studies have been done in animals, so the first thing to say is you need to take that with a pinch of salt. Not all animal studies are relevant to humans, and I understand that, but there have been some human studies that seem to support the effects that are seen in animals. So this taken together does provide quite good evidence that this might be an avenue for future research where more metabolic effects of creatine monohydrate supplementation can be uncovered, but certainly there is evidence that the what I'm going to describe is based in reasonably good there's reasonably good evidence, and there's reasonably good science backing supporting it. So the first thing that you can say is that creatine appears to have an effect on the transporters that are required for glucose to get into cells. There are a number of different ways that glucose can get into cells, and one of the ways is through glucose transporters that are insulin stimulated. So for example, the GLUT4 glucose transporter is a transporter that is it responds to insulin, the insulin receptor. So when insulin binds to the cell, it creates a cellular signal through secondary messengers. Those messengers signal the cell to release these transporters from the inside of the cell. They pass to the cell membrane, and this allows glucose to get into the cell. So that's how insulin stimulates glucose into one of the ways that insulin can stimulate glucose into the cell. Now, creatine monohydrate supplementation appears to increase the number of these GLUT4 transporters on the cell membrane. So it's having an effect that would indicate an insulin-like effect. So that may be, for example, why there is an increase in glycogen synthesis with creatine supplementation. So when you take creatine monohydrate, you get an increase in glycogen synthesis in the muscle. So not only does the creatine content of the muscle go up, you also get an increase in glycogen content. Now, if creatine monohydrate supplementation is stimulating these transporters the same way as insulin does, that means more glucose may be going into the cell, and therefore there may be more synthesis of glycogen, for example. Another thing that creatine does is it does actually increase the synthesis of glycogen and the storage of glycogen in muscle cells. So that would support and back up the fact that studies have looked at the GLUT4 receptor and shown that it is upregulated by creatine. One of the downstream effects of that is that you would expect there to be an increase in glycogen synthesis and glycogen storage within cells, particularly obviously muscle cells, and that appears to be the case. There is, and it's been known for a long time that when you take creatine monohydrate supplements, you not only get an increase in creatine content of skeletal muscle cells, you also get an increase in the glycogen content. And this is where some of the water effects of creatine come in, because glycogen will the increased amount of glycogen in the cell will cause an increase in the requirement for the water to store that glycogen, and so what you tend to get is a hydration effect. So the muscle will feel fuller because there's more glycogen, and that glycogen will associate with water. So there's also more there's also more water in the cell, and that's one of the effects that is known. So creatine causes increase in GLUT4. That will probably increase the glucose passing into the cell. That causes an increase in the glycogen synthesis and the glycogen storage, and in turn that also causes an increase in water storage in the muscle. That's fine, that's all been researched. This has been known for a long time and it's been quite widely talked about. Another thing that creatine will do is it will decrease leucine oxidation. Now, leucine is a branched chain amino acid, and one of the signs that you are catabolizing muscle is that you get a breakdown of some of the branched chain amino acids in the muscle. And leucine, being a branched chain amino acid, when it's oxidized, that indicates the muscle is breaking down. In other words, it's using leucine as a source of energy. Anything that can stop leucine being broken down in the muscle cell, and another supplement that can do this is HMB, and even supplementing with whey protein will have an effect on the decrease in the oxidation of leucine. If you can prevent the oxidation of leucine, you can prevent catabolic effects in skeletal muscle. Now, catabolic is not the same as anabolic. It's not causing new muscle growth, but what you're effectively doing is preventing the breakdown of muscle, so that when you exercise, you're not actually getting the muscle, allowing the muscle to use its own structure to fuel itself. That would be detrimental, because when you train, if you break down leucine and you break down the other branched chain amino acids, you're actually you're breaking down the muscle tissue. So you end up after training with less muscle than you started before. If you can take supplements such as HMB, such as whey protein, that prevent the oxidation of leucine, you have an anti-catabolic effect, and that stops some of that damage. Creatine appears to have the same effect, and it does appear that it will have an anti-catabolic effect by limiting the effects of oxidation of leucine. So taken together, creatine appears to have these effects in the muscle, which you can see are beneficial to athletes. It prevents the muscle using its own protein as an energy source, so it prevents the catabolism of the muscle. It increases the amount of GLUT4 transporters on the muscles on the cell membrane, which increases the glucose passing into the cell, providing more energy. That glucose can also be synthesized into glycogen, which increases glycogen storage, and that storage of glycogen then allows the muscle to hydrate more, because the water must associate with glycogen, because of the way that glycogen requires a certain water ratio within the cell. So all of those are beneficial to the athlete. On top of that, you've got the kind of traditional explanation of how creatine works, which is the creatine monohydrate will go into the cell. The creatine is used to increase the store of phosphocreatine, and that phosphocreatine acts as a buffer to prevent the ATP levels in the cell decreasing too far. And by preventing the ATP decreasing and acting as an energy buffer, there is an ability of creatine through creatine phosphate production to allow a longer duration of intense exercise. So things like sprinting, things like weightlifting, instead of perhaps getting only 10 reps at a particular weight, the extra phosphocreatine, creatine phosphate in the muscle will allow the ATP to be buffered, so that you won't run out of energy, and it maybe allow an extra rep or two. That's effectively the simple way and explanation of how creatine monohydrate supplement works. And then obviously you get the secondary effects that I've just described, those biochemical effects. Now what this video is really about is about the metabolic effects of creatine actually being very similar to insulin. Now those effects that I've described, decrease in the breakdown of leucine, the increase in the amount of GLUT4 transporters on the cell membrane, and the increase in the amount of glycogen synthesis are also effects of insulin. And this is very interesting, because there are a number of studies that have shown that creatine monohydrate supplementation will cause the release of insulin from your pancreas. So the question then is it actually the creatine that's having these effects in the cell, or is it the fact that you are releasing insulin which is then having those effects in the cell? Now you might say to me, what difference does it make? If it's having those beneficial effects, then that's a good thing, surely. Well, let's back up a little bit, because releasing too much insulin in the short term can sometimes be beneficial to performance, particularly if you're a hard training athlete. If you're young, you're fit, you're training hard, extra insulin release sometimes can be beneficial for the effects that I've described: the increase in the GLUT4 transporters, the increase in glycogen synthesis, hydration of the muscle. If creatine is indirectly causing those effects because it's releasing insulin, you could argue that those are beneficial effects. However, the chronic release of high amounts of insulin, such that insulin levels become chronically elevated, can cause dysfunction in the normal glucose homeostatic system. And what some studies have actually shown is that creatine supplementation actually causes changes to glucose homeostasis, which could be described as detrimental, and that can include the formation of insulin resistance. Now, some of these studies have been done in animals, and the majority of these studies have been done in animals, and some of the studies have been done in vitro, which means they've been done in test tubes. And so again, the results of those studies should be taken with caution, because they're not human studies. But animal studies and in vitro studies, and even ex vivo studies that have been done in animal tissues outside of living animals, show generally that creatine monohydrate can stimulate the release of insulin from the pancreas. That, I would say, is quite well evidenced, and I would suggest that those studies taken together support the role of creatine in releasing insulin from the pancreas. How that happens is not fully understood, but it should be noted that creatine is made up of a number of different amino acids. So it's arginine, glycine and methionine basically stuck together form creatine in a kind of a conjugate form. Now, it's known that amino acids are able to also stimulate the release of insulin from the pancreas. So it's not just glucose that causes the release of insulin, it's also the certain amino acids. So it could very well be that creatine supplementation, when you take creatine monohydrate, you're actually directly stimulating insulin release from the pancreas, and then that insulin is having the effects on the GLUT4 transporters, it's having the effects on glycogen synthesis, and it's preventing the breakdown of the oxidation of leucine, because one of the effects of insulin is to have an anti-catabolic effect in muscle, and one of the things it does is it decreases the breakdown of branched chain amino acids. So that could be what's happening. Now, the problem with that is that some studies, including human studies, have found that there are problems with the glucose homeostasis if creatine monohydrate is taken in a chronic way. And animal studies and human studies have shown that following creatine supplementation, there is an exaggerated response of glucose to a glucose tolerance test. And what that indicates is that those individuals were starting to develop a decreased insulin sensitivity, and they were developing insulin resistance. And there is even evidence in animal studies that animals given creatine monohydrate do actually develop insulin resistance. Now, those studies were done in the long term, but all of that evidence put together would suggest that creatine is having metabolic effects that affect the insulin system. Now, interestingly, studies have looked at the release of insulin from humans, and when they find these blood glucose abnormalities, they don't tend to find abnormalities in terms of the insulin system. So while the humans developed raised levels of blood glucose and raised fasting levels of blood glucose, they didn't develop raised levels of insulin. Now, that might be because they weren't taking the creatine for long enough and they didn't develop enough insulin resistance for that to occur. And these effects were rather small. They weren't, life-threatening. It's, important to note that these effects were kind of, within the range of what you might expect from, for example, a poor diet or from lack of exercise. But it's interesting all the same that creatine is having these effects, and this is relating maybe to the way some people find anecdotally, and I've talked to a number of people that have found this, that creatine tended to work for them when they were younger, and as they've got older, the creatine monohydrate supplement that they used to take to have particular effects actually doesn't work as in the way that it used to. And one obvious observation from this is as people age, their insulin sensitivity decreases. That's a natural thing, and their insulin resistance increases. So it could be that in certain individuals and in those people that are sensitive to it, that creatine monohydrate may have these negative effects on the insulin system, which would be exactly what you would expect to find as people age and as they get older, they continue to take creatine or they use creatine. It doesn't have the same quite the same effects as it did when those people were young. I found myself that creatine when I was very young, in my 20s, creatine was effective, and I got some very good strength effects from it. If I use creatine monohydrate now, I don't get the same type of benefits, and in fact I do find it does cause water retention, and I do find perhaps it may even cause the accumulation of body fat, which would fit exactly with these metabolic effects that creatine is having. So that's something to bear in mind. It's not talked about very much. I did try and find whether people are talking about these secondary effects of creatine. Another thing that, and it appears that this is not really these metabolic effects either don't appear to be very well known, or they're just not talked about. Another reason that I suspect that creatine is actually having many of its effects through the release of insulin is that it does affect the brain and it does affect cognition. Now, insulin is a very powerful hormone, and a lot of the effects of insulin do occur in the brain. If one of the things that insulin can do is it can have an effect on the ability of the brain to use glucose, and so if creatine monohydrate was stimulating glucose release from the pancreas, there is you would expect that one of the other effects that it would have would be to have an effect on the brain. Now, that might not be anything to do with the fact that the creatine is getting into the brain or having any direct effect, and I have talked about the cognitive effects of creatine before. But it could be that the creatine is simply causing the release of insulin, which is then causing changes in the glucose utilization by the brain, and that glucose could be altering the cognition of the brain. So that's also something to bear in mind, because this glucose can be used in the brain for many different things, including the formation and synthesis of various neurotransmitters. So this is a topic that's not particularly well covered, and I'm going to try and do some more videos on this in the future, but I just wanted to throw this out there to say that if you've used creatine and you do find that you get weight gain from it, or you do find that you're excessively you're having these effects that are not really described for creatine, many of them I believe are caused perhaps by the fact that creatine, perhaps only in some people, perhaps it's not in all people, and perhaps it depends on circumstances, but creatine does appear to have this effect to be able to cause the release of insulin, and then it does appear to be able to negatively affect glucose homeostasis if you take it in the long term. So this is something to watch. It's something to keep an eye on. It's something maybe that should really be talked about as a side effect of creatine, because clearly it affects people in different ways, and how it really works is not. I don't think the biochemistry of creatine is really fully understood, and although people will claim to understand how a lot of these substances work and how they how they appear to have these effects on the body, it's very easy to be misled by studies, because you can think you're looking at a cause and effect, but what you're actually looking at is an association, and there's another variable involved, and I believe that variable that's not often talked about is insulin, and if creatine can stimulate insulin, many of these effects may actually not be related to creatine directly. They may actually be indirectly related to creatine, but actually directly related to your insulin levels. So I hope you found that interesting. As always, eat well, stay healthy, and protect yourself, and I will see you soon for another video. Take care.